Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. All right, well, today's episode of Right Response Ministries podcast, we are talking about family integrated worship. And this is a foreign concept for many Christians here in the West, particularly in America. Many of you have probably spent the large majority of your parenthood dropping your children off somewhere else other than church. And you might resent the way that I'm framing that statement and say, no, we always took our children to church. Well, you might take them to a building that has church on the side of it as a word. It's labeled that. But if you're not taking them with you into the sanctuary with the ecclesia, the gathering of the saints, and you're dropping them off in a separate room for separate activities, that's simply not church. So let's start there for just a moment and define church. When we church together, using church as a verb, not just the people of God, the consecrated ones, but the activity of church, ecclesia, gathering together. What defines a church, according to the Word of God, is not just merely avoiding all those things which God does not expressly forbid in Scripture, but sticking to the script, doing that which God expressly commands and prescribes in Scripture. We could boil that down to a few things, but I think it's helpful for the sake of simplicity to narrow it to four key ingredients that comprises church on the Lord's Day. That would be the public preaching of the word, the public praying of the word, the public singing of the word in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, as well as the public seeing, S-E-E-I-N-G, seeing of the word in the only two images that the Lord Jesus has actually prescribed for us under the new covenant, which would be baptism and the Lord's Supper. When you drop your children off before church begins in a separate place, a separate room, where these things are not happening. Maybe there's a lesson, maybe there's a coloring sheet, maybe there's a game or an icebreaker or this, that, or the other, but there's not the public preaching of the word from a biblically qualified elder. There is not the public praying of the word from a biblically qualified officer of the church. There's not the sacrament of the Lord's Supper and baptism. And there's not singing with the whole gathered body, addressing one another, not just other children, but parents and grandparents with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Then you have to understand in a theological framework, what you're doing is not taking your children to church. And I have talked to so many parents who have grown children now who no longer attend church, and they'll look at you with this bewildered look on their face and say, Pastor, we don't know how this could have happened. We always raised our children to go to church. We were there every Sunday, snow, sleet, rain, it didn't matter. We were there week in and week out, and we always brought our children to church. But you actually kind of didn't. The fact that your child is now in college, he's 20, 21 years old, and he doesn't go to church, it's not despite your discipleship. It's precisely because of your discipleship. By not bringing him into actual church with you, but dropping him off somewhere else to do some kind of Christian daycare, some kind of Christian alternative to church, but not church, what you actually were discipling your child into, the message that you were conveying is that church is not for him. Church is not for her. And so they are now keeping in step with your own parental discipleship by doing, or in this case, neglecting to do the very thing that you taught them to neglect. That may sound harsh, but that is true. And for those of you who are older parents who already made the mistake, the best thing you can do is to go to your adult child and genuinely repent. Admit that you are wrong and ask for their forgiveness. And trust and pray that the Lord might use that. For those of you who are listening who are younger parents with younger children, the reason I'm saying this in such stark terms is as a warning for you so that you might not make the same mistakes. All right, in today's episode, our very own Wesley Todd has outlined the topic for us. I'll hand it to you.
Well, we're going to go through three key ideas. First, the foundation, how it is that non-family integrated worship became commonplace, especially here in American evangelicalism. We'll then go into the biblical arguments, some more of them. Joel gave a good overview, a 30,000-foot summary, a good overview of why biblically children should be in the service. And we'll end then with practical tips, practical ways that you can make family integrated worship not a battle. If you maybe, let's say last Sunday, you went to your first family integrated church service, it was the first time your children had to sit still for an hour and a half, I guarantee the conversation home went something like this: are we the worst parents in the world? You don't have to be. You can become better. It is a practice. It is something that is a skill. It takes time to get. And so we'll just give some practical means that you can go ahead and make family integrated worship something that your kids are not just surviving, but good at. American evangelicalism during the Cold War, you had the sexual revolution, you had Woodstock, you had the hippie movement, you had all of these things that really revile and really spat in the face of the core Christian, and you could even say white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock and foundation that America was built upon. Many older Christian parents, fathers, workers, they were pretty repulsed by what they saw in the younger generation. And this resulted in a movement called the fundamentalist movement. Bill Gothard would be one of the poster childs of this movement. And it was very much so a bit of a retreat. It was let's get back to our churches. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. I mean, the Cold War, we could be looking at nuclear extinction. We could be looking at the end of times. We could be looking at the rapture at any given moment here. And fundamentalism was a bit of a retreat to, in a good sense, the family. I'm not going to sit here and dog all day on fundamentalists. Many fundamentalists, they were loving families. The dad worked hard. The women were feminine. Church was a priority. Now, there's some anti-intellectualism in the movement. There was also some disconnection from church history. So we wouldn't probably describe ourselves as rigid fundamentalists. But you had this fundamentalist movement that was a reaction, a pushback, a pendulum swing against the broader culture that was growing rapidly more secular in the 70s and the 80s. Well, what happened then is these fundamentalist church movements, they weren't exactly the most welcoming, the most inclusive, and they weren't reaching the culture or going to people where they were at. And that resulted in a movement in the 90s and the 2000s called the church growth movement. And the church growth movement was, if fundamentalism was a reaction to the sexual revolution, the church growth movement was a reaction to fundamentalism, where it said, we've turned people off with the way we speak, we've turned people off with the way we dress, we turn people off with the way that church is conducted, and so we want to welcome these people back in because, as it turned out, the world didn't end, right? The Berlin Wall fell, communism was over, and the 90s and 2000s, barring 9/11 and the war in Iraq, they were relatively peaceful, stable times. So these relatively peaceful, stable times came, and you had different church growth movement leaders and different church planters and pastors like Rick Warren who said, we need to reach all of these people that were turned off by the last generation of fundamentalists. And the key idea was appealing to the lowest common denominator. Church sermons are no longer long. They no longer taught complex theology, but they were short. They were approachable. They pulled from the culture. They pulled from movies. They pulled from pop culture to gather the reference points and make an appeal to the individuals that were in their church. And these churches grew in number. This was the birth of the mega church movement, the mega church as a model where not just a couple hundred or 500, 800 people would attend a service on Sunday, but in the thousands to tens of thousands. This is your Joel Osteen. This is your T.D. Jakes. This is later on in their younger iterations, your Stephen Furticks, for example. Now, when it comes to making church approachable, getting as many people in the door as possible, one of the things that disrupts that atmosphere, one of the things that makes it hard to turn the rock music up to 11, one of the things that makes it hard to get people out of bed is, to be honest, what do you do with the children? Children, the rock service, when your volume, the bass is cranked, the lights are down, the fog machines are roaring, it's not really a great place for an infant. It's not really a great place for a 4-year-old. A sermon that's long, a sermon that's an hour, for example, a liturgy that includes kneeling and confession and prayer and response and creeds, well, that's complex, and children aren't able to understand that. And so with the church growth movement and the growth of these mega churches, multi-site campuses, came the idea of children's church. Parents come into the service. That's who we're appealing to. That's who we want to fill our churches. But for the children, let's set up a separate program. And these separate programs really appealed to parents because it basically functioned as a spiritual daycare. Daycare it's not always been this way in the past, but it still was in the 2000s. it is expensive. Most of you do not get free babysitting unless you have grandkids to have a date night or to have a night out or to have a weekend away. Childcare is a huge burden. And I remember stories of parents saying we would take our kids and we would drop them off at church, at children's church, and we would go out and have brunch. And so the church itself, in some ways, became this place where parents go here. But in order to get the parents here, in order to get them an hour and a half of their devoted time, in order to get an hour and a half of their attention, we've got to do something with the children. That's where children programs were born. These children programs practically became ubiquitous through the 2000s, through the 2010s, and into even still today, where almost any large evangelical church, not necessarily reformed churches, generally speaking, are family integrated, but most of your evangelical churches, they would have a form of children's church where the children go somewhere separate. Now, tons of churches cut these ages off. I don't want to paint with a broad brush. Some of them cut these off very young. So maybe for toddlers, who can be the most disruptive, they might have children's church that only goes up to age 4. Some might go all the way into middle school, right? So 8, 10 years old. But there are churches with entire programs, an entire curriculum that goes all the way up till high school. On every Sunday morning, high school students, 15-year-olds that are reading history, that should be learning Bible in school, they're coming in and they're not hearing from a pastor who, to be honest, is giving closer to a TED Talk than a theological sermon. They're still not equipped, apparently, to listen to him. And so they go to Elevation Youth. They go to the youth ministry. They go to youth church. And so that's the disparity we're getting at. And as many people return to the old ways, they return to tradition, they're realizing that this is not how Christianity functioned in the past. The Christianity, for one, practically and pragmatically, this was something that was impossible to do. You didn't have the room. You had one church building in town, and that church building had one room, and that one room housed everyone. But then even if you could do it, even if you had the means, even if you had the rooms, even if you had the staff, which for the record, this is a huge burden on staff for a church. I've known so many people that have been burnt out by volunteering. They have to volunteer. You have to have volunteers, multiple volunteers, to hang out and watch children and teach lessons every single week. So even if you could do it, even if you had the staff, even if you had the room, there's still theological argument that, wait, the children have never learned separate from their parents. Children have never been separated from the assembly of God. No, where they belong is right alongside their parents together in the assembly. So this isn't even a question of pragmatism. Well, sometimes it's not practical. Sometimes it's difficult. And other times when it's not, when we can do it, we have the freedom to do so. No, we do not. Children belong with their parents on Sunday morning. I'm going to go ahead and give three.
And I'll just jump in there real quick. And I think the concept of individualism is sort of at the heart of the modern church.
Yes.
And this goes back to even our episode on covenant renewal worship, which is that asking the question and answering the question, what is church for? And the modern conception, and this is right in line with American individualism, is that church is for you specifically and not for the body corporately. And so
Right.
these are the parents who are going to church and thinking, I need to learn something. And it isn't that necessarily you shouldn't want to learn something, but that is the sole purpose of church, is that I ought to learn something. On the other end, closer to the other ditch, is that I need to be entertained. And so you can have these rich theological, exegetical sermons, and the parents have toddlers that they're dealing with and tending to throughout the service. And the parents can say, well, I think it would be better that my child wasn't with me so that I could focus a little more and understand a little more and listen a little more, because it is about me. That's the core assumption there. And even going back to your point about the seeker-sensitive movement or the church growth movement, it's like you see this emerge actually even before the 90s in televangelism. And I know you pointed out
Right.
the Joel Osteens, but even Billy Graham was publicizing sermons in the 70s and the 80s. And these things were incredibly, even in the 60s, these things were incredibly popular. But there it is. It's the training of, I can watch a sermon and, oh, he's such a good orator. And he speaks so well to the text and even speaks so well into my life. And that attachment to that particular feeling or that particular education is what people would then flood into the churches with, thinking, I want that same experience. I want the Billy Graham preaching to me, without understanding holistically what this is for. Why are we gathered here as a corporate body? And how is this just as much for my children as it is for me?
The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. Yet your retirement dollars keep shrinking daily as Washington prints money out of thin air. Genesis Gold Group aligns financial guidance with godly principles when others serve only profit. Their faith-centered approach to Gold IRAs stands apart in an industry that has forgotten what true stewardship actually means. Why gamble your family's future on Wall Street's paper promises? Your 401k and IRA deserve better protection. Genesis Gold Group transforms your vulnerable retirement accounts into physical gold, something real, something tangible, something that God created with inherent value. Their faith-driven experts walk you through every step, helping you shield your life's work from the financial storms up ahead. No high-pressure tactics, no hidden fees, just guidance rooted in timeless principles of sound stewardship. So the decision is simple. Watch your retirement evaporate through inflation or secure it in God's precious metal. Take action now. Go and visit rightresponseBibleGold.com. You can visit today for your free book, The Bible and Gold, and join the thousands of believers who sleep soundly knowing their future is anchored in something unshakable. Again, that's rightresponseBibleGold.com, safeguarding your legacy with God's timeless treasure. The British statesman Edmund Burke once noted that, and I quote, "When ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, the loss cannot possibly be estimated." And it seems that we live in such times where ancient opinions and rules of life have indeed been taken away. We are not estimating the loss, but rather experiencing it in real time. Speaking of such times as ours, Nicholas Gomez de Villa said, and I quote, "Modern man is scandalized by what was commonplace in traditional society. The most radical book of our time would be a compendium of old proverbs," end quote. A compendium of old proverbs, truths, and wisdom that were once commonplace in traditional society is just what is needed right now. Who is My Neighbor is precisely this book. It's an encyclopedia of ancient opinions, rules of life, and truths, once forgotten, but now recovered. Get this controversial book from Amazon or directly from the publisher, Western Front Books, at the link below in the show notes. That's westernfrontbooks.com. Again, westernfrontbooks.com.
Evangelical crusades, there's real people that were saved. My grandparents were saved at a Billy Graham crusade and continue to this day to follow Christ. But it did kind of teach people it's an individualistic thing. Outside, Billy Graham, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That's when he was running his crusades. They were all over the world. There was very much so a disconnected sense, and he tried to connect people to the local bodies.
Yep.
But he would come and we'd have a crusade, and a year later, 95% typically of the people that raised their hand that supposedly gave their life to Christ, they weren't connected to a church. They weren't attending it. And so we do have to recognize there was certainly some good done, but there was also a lot of chaff that when time came, they never got connected to the local church. They never integrated with historic Christianity. They felt emotional. They raised their hand. They tried for a couple weeks. And then a lot of them went back to the life that they were living. So having laid the foundation, let's get into the biblical arguments for children being integrated into the church service. The first one is covenant inclusion. Children belong to the assembled people of God. In Deuteronomy 31:12, Moses commanded, "Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones." All of them. Never are the adults. In even sober moments, I think of the covenant blessings and covenant curses that were recited from two sides of the mountain. That assembly means the people, men, women, children. Ephesians 6:1 that we read in the cold open, Paul specifically addresses children. So Paul, this letter to the church in Ephesus, Paul does not say, "Parents, tell your children to obey you in the Lord." No, he says fathers and then children, implying you children assembled with the church here at Ephesus. Listen to your parents because they're sitting right beside them. Acts 2:39, this promise is to you and to your children. We have got to stop thinking individualistically. It's about me individually. It's about my wife individualistically. Families are generally the way that God relates to humanity. He relates to the family. You take a really large family over a couple hundred years, a race, a nation. So God deals with the families at the national level, families at the individual level. There's such an idea. Achan was put to death alongside his family. His sin was so great. We see in Deuteronomy, we see in Acts, we see in Ephesians. It's the family that's assembled. It's the family that's assembled. It's the family that's assembled. And as you said, Joel, all the things that go into church, seeing the word in the Lord's Supper, hearing the word in song, in preaching, in reading, praying the word prayer. How is it that we could say children are included in the assembly and yet they participate in none of those things? They're not present for it. They don't hear the word. They don't sing the word. They don't preach, or they don't sit under the preaching of the word. They don't observe the word in the sacraments. You can't meaningfully say they belong to the assembly of the people when you disconnect them from the assembly when it functions as the assembly. The word for church, ecclesia in Greek, it means gathering. That gathering has all over the Bible, Old Testament, Old Covenant people of God, New Covenant people of God, always included the children. 2, corporate worship is formative, not merely informational. Biblical worship is not primarily an age-calibrated instruction or an intellectual teaching feature. It's covenant renewal, it's encountering the word, confession, praise, and sacrament. Joel 2:16 says, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the people, consecrate the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children, even nursing infants. Let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber." Even the nursing infants. Elsewhere in the Psalms, we see that even let the children sing a song to the Lord. Again, the idea being, we're not talking just about intellectual formation. We're not talking about information download. Covenant renewal worship, like we talked about just a little bit ago, covenant renewal worship forms people. It forms their conception of God. It shapes how they think about worship. It instills in them reverence. If church was a TED Talk that gave information or tips for a better marriage or 3 ways to have less anxiety, it would make sense that children wouldn't be included in that. And that would make sense because we made church that in the seeker-sensitive movement, the church growth movement. It became those intellectual, informative, lecture-style teachings. But when we go to the Bible, we see that's not what it's about at all. It's an encounter with God. On the Lord's Day, God uniquely calls us to him. It's not that we see with our physical eyes, but through faith, we behold, we ascend the mountain, and we come before Jesus, and that forms us. And so all that we do, the songs, the praise, the sacraments, those are intended to form a people. And much of that formation, we have to recognize the church was formed with most of the church being illiterate for 1,000, 1,500 years. Most of the church didn't even know how to read. They would hear a sermon. They wouldn't even be able to write down the key points of the sermon. How were they formed? They heard singing. They saw the Lord's Supper. They heard from someone who's instructing them in the word. Why is it that children cannot participate in that the way they did for all of those hundreds of years?
Yeah, and this is a bit of an aside, but I'll add it, which is it also forms your conception, family integrated worship, that is, it forms your conception of the family. So Voddie Baucham, in his book, Family Shepherds, he actually talks about this a bit, which is the nature of familial fragmentation today is like the view of the father coming home from work and the mom's in the kitchen and the children are upstairs in their bedroom or playing outside. And it is the separation, even at church, that forms children's conceptions of the family, what the family should do together versus what it should do separate. And so at every turn, really, civilizationally, we're telling children, you actually don't belong to your family. You participate in your family, but you don't belong. You actually belong to yourself. And again, this is that individualism. But you should also add to this the idea of how the nature of children and how they learn. To your point, Wes, it's just as much lived instruction as it is taught instruction. So it's just as much example, if you will,
yes,
for a father. I mean, we raised a generation of children who literally said, "I never saw my father pray. Never saw him pray. Not at the dinner table." Now, the father will say, "I did pray. I prayed privately in my bedroom. I prayed during church, but my children weren't there." And so the children aren't actually being grafted into the family, into the church corporate, because they're not taught to belong. They're not shown to belong to that body.
Yeah. The family, that would be the last one. The family, not the church program, bears primary discipleship responsibility. Fathers are addressed in Ephesians. They're addressed in Colossians. Fathers instructing your children in the Lord. If children are removed from corporate worship for most of the service, fathers and mothers lose a key opportunity to model, like you said, attentiveness, reverence, confession, singing, and reception of the preached word. Integrated worship reinforces biblical patriarchy in the sense of a paternal headship, covenant solidarity, and intergenerational discipleship. A segregated program can unintentionally outsource spiritual formation. I have been tasked by God, with the task of training, equipping, and educating my children. Now, my wife practically, because I work to provide and care for the home, my wife practically will carry out a good amount of that instruction through homeschooling. We homeschool, but He's holding me responsible. I will not be able to say, well, I took them to Sunday school. Weren't they taught there? Or my wife did homeschooling. I am the one that has been charged by God to ensure they have been raised up in the education of the Lord. And the church has not been given that task. The church is not the primary responsibility for shepherding my children. Now, the pastors there and the preaching of the word absolutely will shepherd them. Their teachers that are there, the choir, the singing, those will shepherd them. But I'm uniquely responsible. And if I go to church and say, your spiritual formation is going to be handled by a 25-year-old woman in the 4th grade Sunday school, I have completely exported all of my responsibility, all of my duty, everything that God is charging me with to someone else that I'm not even listening to. I don't know what she taught. I don't know what was said. I don't even know if she's capable. In some terrible cases, these are people that are wicked people that are involved in children's church, and they abuse the children. If they're sitting beside me, even if I disagree with something in the sermon, even if I disagree with how something is done, I can then say, as a father who's been charged, now, son, I know, we heard this. I actually hold a little bit of a different view, and it's this. And I can stand before the Lord with a clear conscience and say, as best I could with my conscience as my God and your word, being in it and praying, I discipled my children in the best way that I knew how to, according to the scriptures. If you send them out for training elsewhere, someone else is doing it with no oversight from you.
Yeah, and that's the exhortation from in. It's like, if you want to restore the patriarchy, then you have to seize every opportunity to put the patriarchy in practice. I guess it's a silly example, but I think about it in terms of a sports team. Everyone can relate to this. You played sports growing up. You'll have your captains on the team. You'll have your head coach. And at every moment, in every environment, in every game, and every practice, you can look to someone and say, that man right there, he represents me. He represents me as he goes up to the middle of the field to flip the coin. He represents me as the coach who goes and shakes the other coach's hand, talks with the referees, etc. That's how humans are actually formally bonded, is by seeing a leader and following the leader. And so that, to your point, Wes, it's in every sphere of life. It's the father taking responsibility to say, I want, as I stand in church, I want my children to look at me and say, that's my father. I belong to this family. Our family belongs to this church, and to take instruction from that.
And Dad, one last piece to it. Every person that participates in children's church, to teach it, to organize it, to watch the children, is one more person that cannot sit under the preaching of the word.
That's right.
Like think about that. Hey, here's a month. You volunteer once a month. Great. You don't get to hear the sermon at the very minimum on Sunday. Some of you won't even, if it's a communion Sunday, you won't even get to take the Lord's Supper. It's criminal, really. It is robbing members of the church, Christ's sheep, of the primary means that he has given to them to be shaped, to be formed, to be exhorted, to be encouraged. And some churches get around this with 2 services. Oh, well, you can...
Just whack-a-mole. It's like, you're going to create one problem. It's like, oh, now you don't have one church body gathering together. Now you have 2 separate bodies. They don't even know each other. But we're doing that to solve the issue that people are watching the children and have to go to church. And so it's like, if you're not systematic... And so they're not going to
exasperate you by requiring 5 hours of you on Sunday morning, when all you had to do was bring them into the service, and everybody can listen to it. It is a terrible thing to, especially with volunteers, to rob them again and again of being able to sit in church and listen to the word. There are practical considerations of security, some other things, but even those should be kept to an absolute minimum. And if you have 4 different children's Sunday school classes, not Sunday school, children's church classes, that's 4 teachers at minimum, if not more supporting staff, that simply cannot sit under the preaching of the word.
When it comes to your financial future, are you planning forward or backwards from your desired results? What type of financial culture do you want to create for your family and for your children's children? We are not called to be wise as doves. Therefore, simpleton planning simply won't cut it. Joe Garrissey helps families develop and implement a long-term culture of excellent financial management. He starts with your goals, your tithing plan, your retirement, and the legacy that you want to build for your generations. And then he works backwards to build a real actionable plan to get your family on track. Now, many of my personal friends have benefited from the financial wisdom of Joe Garrissey that he shared for their specific situations. Do you want to work with someone who strives for alpha with your investing, hates taxes, and brokers insurance? Start planning smart. Call Joe Garrissey at 615-767-2555. Again, that's 615-767-2555. Or you can find him by going to backwardsplanningfinancial.nm.com. Again, that's backwardsplanningfinancial.in as in Nancy, M as in ministries.com. Yeah, that's what initially won me over to family integrated worship. Eventually, over time, I came to see all the other arguments that you guys have so eloquently made in this episode today. But that was the first thing that started the conversation for me, where I was willing to make the change. This was probably, 2018, 19, something like that. I was in San Diego at that time, and just came to the point where I realized, especially as it pertained to the Lord's Supper, I just realized that, that there were people who were missing, adults, because they were serving as volunteers in the children's ministry, and we're taking the Lord's Supper and they're not there. And I was looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 11 as we're observing the body, as we're commanded to do, and reading the text even on the Lord's Day as I'm about to administer the sacrament. And as I'm reading through it, one of the condemnations that St. Paul offers is that in the case of the Corinthian church, they were showing up at separate times. Those who had more were showing up early and leaving nothing for those who had less. And he says, are you not divided? And I realized that yes, there's a spirit of division, right? Division of the heart that's of supreme importance, where we're harboring bitterness towards one another, or we're not united in faith, or we're, refusing to forgive one another, or neglecting to follow the process that Jesus laid out for church discipline in Matthew 18, how we confront our brother if there's some kind of grievance between us. There's that spiritual element of division, but I think that that's implicit. I think it's certainly implicit in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, but what's explicitly mentioned by the apostle is that the church is split down the middle, two different halves of the church, and they're showing up physically divided at two separate times. And that's condemned in no unapologetic or in unapologetic terms. That's just explicitly condemned by the apostle. You guys are divided. You're showing up, some of you early, some of you later, and you're physically divided. You are not together. And that began to bug me. As I thought about that and prayed about that more and more, I realized that here we are taking the Lord's Supper, and there's a whole group of our church, a number of adults volunteering in the children's ministry, and then our children themselves, and they're over here in the separate room while we're taking the supper without them. And that was enough right there to change my mind on this particular issue and say, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. And then, as I thought about it more and continued to grow in my doctrine, then I eventually landed on all the other reasons that you guys have cited today. But that was the first one, and the plainest to me was the word is being preached, the word is being prayed, the word is being sung, and the word is being seen in the Lord's Supper and baptism, and about a third of the church isn't here. And I had, as a pastor, I had no argument to defend it. None. Any argument that I could think of is the sermon goes over the heads of the younger children because they're not on that intellectual level. It's really good for them to hear things, at their level with illustrations that they can understand. All those arguments, as good as they may be, the problem was that all those things could be done outside of church. You have 6 other days in the week. I mean, how many dinners do you have in a week where the father can be teaching a Bible story to his children and giving some kind of illustration or analogy. Like everything that's happening in children's church in terms of not the games, but like, because nobody's defending that. They're defending, it's the substance, right? It's actually the teaching at a child's level. That's of immense importance. But I was like, well, but our children are with us all week long. We could be teaching them those things, and we shouldn't be putting them in public school, right? So it's either homeschool or maybe a Christian, a classical school, but they're being taught for 40 hours a week, just school hours, at their level and in a way that they can comprehend. Then family worship in the home with dinner time, or before bedtime in the evenings and all these different things. So why is it that children can't sit for an hour and 15 minutes one time a week and something be over their heads? They're still going to catch something. They're going to come away with some questions. They can be asking their parents on the way home. The pastor used this word. What does it mean? But even if they miss 70% of the sermon because intellectually they're just not there and able to grasp it, that's an hour and 15 minutes a week. They have 40 hours during their school hours. They should be receiving a Christian education through homeschool or a Christian education through a classical school. They shouldn't be in public school. And then an additional, 15, 30 minutes with family worship, striving for 5-6 nights a week, with dad when he comes home from work at the dinner table. And so like all those arguments just kind of fell on their face, like to say like, well, we have to do this because actually we're not neglecting our children. We really, really love them. And because we love them, we want them to understand. And at a certain point, you could see right through it. You knew that was BS, that's not really the argument. The argument is really just for convenience. Parents are embarrassed because they're not parenting their children. Their children are not disciplined in the home, and therefore their children are not capable. They should be, but they're not capable of sitting through an hour and 15 minutes. And the parents, find it distracting, find it embarrassing because their child is acting up publicly where other people can hear them and see them. And I just realized like we're doing all of this as a ruse to mask our bad parenting, to cover up our bad parenting. Like we are literally sending a third of the church between the children and other adults. So me as a father, I'm making some other young woman miss the Lord's Supper to babysit my kids while I go to church, and she can't.
Because I'm a bad parent.
Because I'm embarrassed that my kid might act up because I don't actually discipline them consistently in the home. That's children's church, right? If you want to know, what is children's church? Children's church is the desperate attempt of neglectful parents who have not disciplined their children and therefore are afraid that their children will act the way they always do without discipline, but this time on Sunday morning publicly in front of other parents that might bring them shame. And so because of their personal shame and embarrassment for their own parental neglect, they have selected a young woman, Christian woman, to miss the Lord's Supper, miss the sermon, miss the church to babysit their child so that they can be child-free. That's children's ministry. And when I began to see it like that, I was like, and we don't want to unnecessarily draw a hard line on certain issues, but on this one, I'm going to draw a hard line. If you're doing that, you're in sin. If you're a parent doing that, sending your kid, you're in sin. If you're a pastor facilitating that in your church, that program, you're in sin. This is one of those issues. I feel stronger about this than I do baptism. I'll just say it point blank. If you think that there needs to be a profession of faith that precedes baptism, you might be right, you might be wrong. But if you think other adults, Christian adults, should miss out on church to babysit your kids, that one, I think it's clearer than baptism. That one, you're blatantly in sin. So, all right, any other thoughts?
Well, I want to get into just some practical tips for parents. I'm going to defer to you two because you both have more children than I do. But I will say practically, there are some practical considerations, and a big one is nursing mothers. We're not talking about nursing mothers that have to step out. We're not talking about having to take your kids to the car. What we are talking about is day in and day out. Do your kids spend the majority of the service sitting in their seat, or at least in the pew, being quiet, being well-behaved, or do they spend the majority of it outside, spend the majority of it doing something else, spend the majority of it in another room? And this can even apply. Your church could be family integrated, but you yourself physically are outside 70% of the time with a kid or multiple kids. You're still functionally doing the core idea, the core spirit of what we're talking about today, which is you're not sitting down, listening to the word, your children beside you being formed in attentiveness, reverence, respect, and worship. Practical tips. So parents, not just maybe they didn't grow up doing this, they themselves, they have a couple kids, they haven't done this with their kids, they're going to do it. Maybe their church still separates the children, but they've decided they're going to bring their children into church. They're going to be family integrated. As for me and my house, we will obey in this area. What are some practical things to have in mind as you begin that?
Yeah, well, I would say certainly the hardest years are the toddler years. So I'm thinking about the age of probably about 18 months to about three, perhaps 3.5 maybe. Those are probably the most difficult because there is functionally nothing that your child can understand from the service. I mean, end to end, it's just essentially for them, it's just sitting down, being still, being quiet. And so practically speaking for a toddler, and we've talked about this on our family worship episode, but practically speaking, that is just something that you have to inculcate, you have to discipline them into at home. It's through family worship. It's practicing being able to sit down, be still. Maybe it starts small. It's, hey, can you sit down for 1 minute? Can you sit down for 5 minutes? Can you sit down for 10 minutes? And continuing to reinforce that at home, giving them a setting outside of church where they have to exhibit that behavior is going to be the most important thing.
Every skill that's tested requires lots of work on the back end for performance.
Yep.
If you have a quiz and you have an exam, if it's an hour exam, do you only spend an hour in practice? No. You study hours for it. Take the exam, study it.
Well,
ordinarily at a rigorous university that is accredited, you would need to study for multiple hours before that.
I went to a university. It was accredited. I don't know if it was rigorous. That's, I would have to take a little license. But I was very proud of the fact that I tallied it up. I think it was 4.5 hours throughout the 4 years outside of class time.
That's incredible.
Study, homework, project.
Oh, and it was a STEM degree, right?
No, it was a dual major with business and biblical studies. I'm not saying it was rigorous, but I am saying that I actually have a diploma from Dallas Baptist University. It's not the most rigorous, but it is accredited. It's a real school. I have the diploma sitting in my garage, and I spent less than 5 hours outside of class.
Yeah.
And to be clear, that's across the 4 years.
That's across incredible. The 4 years.
But
I heard that and I was like, 4 hours a semester. Like, wow, you're skating by. You're like, oh, my brother in Christ. No.
I spent about an hour and 15. Yeah, about an hour and 10 minutes or so per year. And
that's why your diploma just says at the bottom, it says, thanks for showing up.
I'll be honest, though, to be completely honest, in terms of what I learned and what I still find to be useful today, I'd like to get that 4.5 hours back. I really feel gypped.
Yeah. But to your point, Wes, yes, practicing outside of the context and then going in to perform. It's game time. That it's going to be important to provide settings for your children, your toddlers specifically, to be able to practice those things and frankly, just receive discipline for not listening to you.
Yeah, you guys are absolutely right. We talked about this when we did the family worship episode, and I brought up. It's really not that novel, but a lot of people, I think, were blessed by it because for whatever reason, I think a lot of, I don't know, it's just not addressed. So I guess it is novel, but you wouldn't think it's, I think
we hear a lot about to do family worship,
right?
But very few examples of how it's practically
well, and I
done.
think what I was going to say is there's some of that, you're right. So everybody's saying do family worship, and then some will tell you how. But what I addressed in that episode that was a little bit different, but I think makes perfect logical sense is I said, for our family, we bifurcate. So we have, family worship. That's usually surrounding the dinner table. But then we also, we try to do that 5 nights a week. And then, a couple nights, maybe 2 or 3, we try to do family church is what we call it. And I was saying that, for that, what we do is we take, we finish dinner, we finish family worship. And maybe it's, an evening where we got done with dinner more quickly, family worship more quickly. We've got, 15 minutes to spare. So we leave the dishes dirty on the table. We take the chairs, we line them up in a row, facing forward to like the island in our kitchen. I then stand behind the island. I grab a Bible. I get my sermon notes from either the coming week, or you say, well, Joel, you can do that because you're a pastor. So then, okay, take your sermon notes from the previous week. And it's not even the sermon notes, it's actually the liturgy. And I just read through the liturgy, starting at the very beginning. Let us now begin to worship the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all the way to the benediction. There's some scripture reading. There's a little bit of lead and response, with a prayer of confession of sin and the Apostles' Creed and those kinds of things. We'll lift our hands and sing the doxology at the end, right before the benediction. And I'll basically do all of that, including reading the text from the previous week's sermon or the text for the upcoming Sunday, but no sermon. So it's basically just going through the liturgy and the text for Sunday, but with no exposition. And it takes about 15 minutes. And the whole goal, and we prep the team, all 5 of the children and mom, and saying, all right, here's the goal. Mom doesn't have to be told this, but she's on first line of defense, watching the children, helping to orchestrate. Here's the deal. We're going to do family church. This is not family worship. So it's not as interactive. You're not, doing catechism back and forth. We're not doing it as we're eating food and saying, pass, the butter or the salt or whatever. We are staying in our chair. We are not moving. We are not speaking except for the portions that are lead and response. And our eyes are up ahead, and we are practicing for church. And that's, to sum it up, family worship is vital. But family worship is not good practice for church, because let's just be honest, at a practical level, family worship, just the nature of it, the arrangement, is very different than church. Church, we're sitting in rows, we're facing the front. Family worship is usually around the dinner table, or it's in the living room on the couches, but it's arranged in a circle. We're facing each other, right? Church is, for the most part, quiet. Family worship is a lot of questions and answers and speaking, and we're all we're sharing together. Church, we're not eating a meal, right? And there's maybe a couple snacks for, the little ones, the 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, but for the most part, we're not eating a meal. Family worship is around a dinner table often, including a meal. And so my point is that family worship at the practical level, just the dynamics of it, is very different than church. And so family worship needs to happen for another purpose, like what I said earlier, in terms of being on the child's intellectual level and for their comprehension, for their memorization, for their understanding. For that's the purpose of family church. It's to train, right? But that's the purpose of family worship. But what we call family church, where we sit in a row, the purpose of that is strictly to practice for Sunday. It's to practice for Sunday. And I think family worship, it has its own purpose, child learning. But if you think that your family worship will also serve a dual purpose, where it's the child learning the things of God, but also practically simulating the corporate worship Sunday experience, and that somehow it will serve as practice for that environment, then I think you're just not thinking about it clearly. It's actually training the child in terms of their knowledge of the Lord in a very positive way. But it's also training the child, practically speaking, for what church physically looks like and entails. It's training them not in the right direction. And because church is not around a table, it's not facing each other, it's not interactive, and we don't get to do it while eating, chicken legs or whatever. So if that's your only practice for Sunday, then you're practicing wrong. And it's not that practice makes perfect, but the old adage goes, perfect practice makes perfect. So you just have to do a little bit more, right? Parenting is hard. It's like, so another thing, you're going to have to work. You're a parent. You have children. I don't know what to tell you. And it's not that hard. Your family worship can be anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the ages of the children. And you can do it simultaneously as you're having dinner. You can shoot for 5 nights a week and typically hit, 3 to 5. And you could do better, but that's something, and I think that honors the Lord, and that's good. And all I'm advocating for is on 2 of those nights of family worship, when the meal is done and the family worship, the catechism, the scripture memory, when that's done, then just before cleaning up, before getting ready for bed, take the chairs, put them in a row, and give it 15 more minutes of dad is talking and the children are being quiet. And that's immensely helpful. It's not reinventing the wheel, but it's really helpful.
Habits are so incredibly powerful. There's a good book, Atomic Habits. If there's something you want to change in life, it's not going to be easy typically to change it. But if you make it a habit, you can make a lot of progress on something that seems so insurmountable. So when it comes to family worship, yes, also, but also integrated church, make the habit that they're with you. Make the habit you need to sit down. Make the habit you need to pay attention. As your children get old enough, 3 years old, they should be able to generally recite the Apostles' Creed. Hey, you need to memorize this. Hey, you need to sing along to the doxology. Keep that habit up. Paul says in Galatians, persevere in doing good. You persevere in it, you will be shocked how different your family could look in a year. But you have to have the discipline day in and day out. A Sunday morning where everyone woke up early and you don't want to do it. You're tired. You've had a busy week at work. Still get in there. Continue to put the reps in. You'll be shocked at what you can do. But if you don't start it, and if you lag, and if you refuse to follow up, well, you're going to be just in the same spot a year later. Well, this isn't easy. Yeah, because you haven't put the work in to accomplish the hard thing that you want to do. But if you put the work in, there's dozens of families in our church. Their children are well behaved. They sit still. As they get older, they listen, they take notes. It's perfectly possible. And it's perfectly possible for you. It may seem far off where you're at, but your children are perfectly capable of being disciplined, sitting their butt down in a chair, and being quiet for an hour and a half. That is perfectly achievable.
Yeah. Habits, to your point, habits always have a really high starting cost. There's that's friction, the static friction of not having done something and starting to do it. And it can be really painful. But to your point, once you get momentum, once you get a motion to it, if you will, things become really easy. And then I would just say, just to add quickly, there will be times where you'll have to discipline your child in church, and you should do that. You should step outside. If they're not listening, if they're not doing the thing that you've taught them to do, that you'll have to punish them. Children, particularly if they're unruly or intelligent even perhaps, they can detect ever so slightly when they're in a different context, and they'll test you. They'll test to see, is this a little different? Is this, and they'll push limits. And so there are going to be times naturally when a toddler who's 2.5 or 2 is going to try to do something a little bit, get away with a little bit more because you're in church, and you should take them out and force the standard all the same.
I have a hilarious story we can end this with. My parents practiced family integrated worship. I was with them every Sunday. And there was a while where my dad taught Sunday school. And so we're sitting in the pew, and I know that he's about to go up and have to start preaching. And so he doesn't really have the lateral. He doesn't have the time to take me out back. And so he says, Wes, come sit over here. I look at him, if you can believe it. And I was defiant because I knew he had to get up. So my dad gets up, walks up to the pulpit and says, well, I'm going to go ahead and ask Pastor Dan to lead us in another song. I have a unique parenting opportunity. Comes back down, picks me up, takes me out of church, spanks me in the van, comes up and teaches Sunday school.
Incredible.
But that's what it was. It was, my son defied me.
Patriot.
I have a parenting opportunity. My face, I have to imagine when he said that, I'm sitting there smug like I won, being spanked in an hour, problem for future Wes. He says, I have a unique parenting opportunity. No. But sometimes you got to do that.
Yeah. That's a Chad move.
That's I have some parenting move to do. And you go out and do it.
It reminds me of a video I just recently saw. It's a man, he's running from a lion. And he says, dear Lord, please change this lion's heart. Make him a Christian. And the lion falls to his knees, puts his paws together and says, dear Lord, bless this meal I'm about to eat. And the man turns, he's like, and that's like, I imagine the same feeling Wes had at that moment.
Yeah. That's
No.
All right. Well, that has been, I think, a great episode. I hope that you found a lot of practical tools that you can implement in your homes for the sake of your children. And I do hope that hopefully some hearts and minds have been changed, and that if this is new to you, that you would develop by the grace of God that conviction that your children should be trained in your home and they should be with you in church. And that's probably the simplest way that I could put it. Your children's spiritual formation and training should be happening in your home, and your children's presence should be with you in church. Pretty simple principle, but truly, at the risk of sounding cliche, life-changing. So we hope you've been blessed. And if you are willing and able, if you're not able to, we understand. But if you've been blessed by this ministry and you're willing and able to do so, right here at the end, I would just ask that you would prayerfully consider supporting this ministry. If you would like to support us financially, you can do so by going to rightresponseministries.com/donate. Again, that's rightresponseministries.com/donate. Thanks for tuning in, and God bless.